The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, cheerful and decorated with animated balloons. Surprise retirement party for Amelia Brooks, it announced, complete with cake emojis and a timestamp for Friday at 3 p.m. The only problem? I hadn't submitted my retirement letter. I hadn't even turned 40 yet. I stared at the screen, my coffee growing cold as the implications sank in. Someone wanted me gone, and they were throwing me a party to celebrate it. My name is Amelia Brooks. And for the past 8 years, I've been the senior marketing director at Pinnacle Dynamics, a mid-sized tech consulting firm nestled in the heart of downtown Seattle. I've built campaigns that tripled our client base, launched products that became industry standards, and mentored a team that other companies regularly try to poach. I've also, apparently, made some very powerful enemies. The sender of the email was Diane Morrison, our bubbly HR representative who usually handled birthday parties and team-building exercises. But I knew she was just the messenger. The real architect of this celebration sat 3 floors above me in the corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of Elliott Bay. Richard Blackwood, CEO of Pinnacle Dynamics, had been circling me like a vulture for months. Ever since I'd discovered his little accounting discrepancy during our quarterly review, he'd been looking for ways to remove me from the equation. The problem was, I was too good at my job to fire outright, and too well connected within the industry to simply let go without cause. So apparently, he'd decided to retire me instead. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, watching the morning light filter through the blinds of my office. My walls were covered with awards, certifications, and photos from successful product launches. 8 years of my life lived within these 4 walls, and someone thought they could simply throw me a party and make it all disappear. They were about to learn just how wrong they could be. The first step was reconnaissance. I needed to understand the scope of their plan before I could dismantle it. I started with Diane, whose weakness had always been her need to be involved in office drama. It took exactly 1 casual conversation by the coffee machine and a sympathetic ear about her weekend dating disasters to get her talking. "Oh, Amelia, I'm so sorry about the mix-up with the email," she said, stirring her 3rd packet of sugar into her latte. "Mr. Blackwood asked me to organize it so quickly. He said you'd mentioned wanting to pursue other opportunities, and the board thought it would be nice to give you a proper send-off." Interesting. So he'd told the board I was leaving voluntarily. That meant he needed to maintain that narrative, or risk questions about why a successful director was being pushed out. "That's so thoughtful," I replied, matching her cheerful tone. "I'm curious, though, how did the board hear about my plans? I haven't made any formal announcements." Diane's face flickered with uncertainty. "Well, Mr. Blackwood mentioned it during their last meeting. He said you'd spoken privately about feeling burned out and wanting to spend more time with family." Family. That was rich, considering Richard knew perfectly well I was single and had no children. But it was a convenient excuse that would be hard to disprove. I spent the rest of the morning reaching out to my network, making casual inquiries about job opportunities. Not because I intended to leave, but because I needed to understand what story was being told about my departure. The responses were telling. "I heard you were taking early retirement," said Marcus Chen, a former colleague at our biggest competitor. "Blackwood mentioned it at the industry mixer last week, said you were ready for a change of pace." So Richard wasn't just pushing me out, he was actively managing the narrative to ensure I couldn't easily land anywhere else. The retirement story made me seem like someone stepping away from the game entirely, not someone who might be available for a better position. By Wednesday, I had a clearer picture of the situation. Richard had been methodically laying groundwork for my departure, telling different stories to different people, but maintaining the core narrative that I was leaving voluntarily. The party was meant to be the final act, a public celebration that would cement the story and make it awkward for me to claim otherwise. It was actually quite clever. In a twisted way, I had to admire the thoroughness of it. But Richard had made one crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed I would go quietly, that I'd be too embarrassed or defeated to fight back. He clearly didn't know me very well. Thursday morning, I began my counterattack. Step 1 was documentation. I spent hours combing through my email archives, pulling together every piece of correspondence that demonstrated my value to the company. Client testimonials, project successes, performance reviews, revenue reports. I created a comprehensive portfolio that painted a picture of not just competence, but excellence. Step 2 was allies. I reached out to my team, my clients, and key stakeholders within the company. I didn't tell them about the retirement party directly, but I started planting seeds about my ongoing projects and future plans. I mentioned quarterly goals that extended well beyond Friday, upcoming client presentations, and a new marketing strategy I was developing for the next fiscal year. The idea was to create cognitive dissonance. When people heard about my retirement, it would conflict with all the future-focused conversations I'd been having with them. Step 3 was leverage. I pulled out the file I'd been keeping on Richard's accounting irregularities. It wasn't enough to get him fired, but it was certainly enough to cause serious problems if it reached the wrong ears. Or rather, the right ears. The irregularities centered around consultant fees that seemed inflated and vendor relationships that appeared suspiciously cozy. Nothing overtly illegal, but enough to warrant investigation if someone cared to look closely. I'd originally planned to handle it through proper channels, but Richard had escalated things by targeting me. Now it was time to escalate back. Friday morning arrived with unseasonable sunshine and a flurry of activity around the office. I could see people whispering in corners, and there was definitely more foot traffic past my office than usual. The retirement party was clearly the talk of the building. I dressed carefully that morning, a sharp black suit that commanded respect, my lucky red heels that added 3 inches to my height, and the pearl necklace my grandmother had given me for luck. If I was going to war, I was going to look the part. At 10 a.m., I sent an email to the entire company. The subject line read, "Clarification regarding today's event." The message was brief, but pointed. I've received several inquiries about today's retirement celebration. I want to clarify that while I appreciate the thoughtfulness behind the gesture, I have not submitted any retirement paperwork and have no plans to leave Pinnacle Dynamics. I'm excited about our upcoming projects and look forward to continuing to contribute to our team's success. Looking forward to seeing everyone at 3 p.m. for what I assume will be a lovely party for reasons I'm still trying to understand. The response was immediate and electric. Within minutes, my phone was ringing. First my assistant, then my team members, then colleagues from other departments. The office buzz shifted from whispered excitement to confused murmuring. At 11:30, Richard's assistant called to request a meeting. I told her I was available at 4 p.m., after the party. The power play was subtle, but clear. I wasn't going to be summoned to explain myself before I'd had my moment to shine. At 2:45, I made my way to the conference room where the party was being held. Someone had gone all out with decorations, streamers, and a large cake that read, "Happy Retirement, Amelia," in cheerful blue frosting. The irony wasn't lost on me. The room was packed, not just with my immediate colleagues, but with people from throughout the company, board members, senior staff, even some clients who'd been invited to what they thought was a genuine celebration. Richard stood near the front, his smile looking increasingly strained as he caught sight of me. I walked directly to the center of the room, my heels clicking authoritatively on the polished floor. Conversations died as people turned to look at me. I could feel the weight of their attention, the confusion and curiosity rippling through the crowd. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the room. "I'm truly touched by this unexpected celebration. When I received the email about my retirement party, I was as surprised as many of you probably are right now." I paused, letting that sink in. In the corner, I could see Richard's face growing pale. Because, as those of you who work closely with me know, I haven't retired. I haven't submitted any paperwork, made any announcements, or indicated in any way that I'm ready to leave this company I've helped build for the past 8 years. The murmuring grew louder. I could see people turning to look at Richard, then back at me. The confusion was palpable. In fact, I continued, I've been working on some exciting new initiatives that I'd love to share with you, projects that will take us well into the next fiscal year and beyond. I reached into my portfolio and pulled out a presentation folder. I've been developing a comprehensive expansion strategy for our Pacific Northwest operations. It's designed to increase our market share by 40% over the next 18 months. The room was completely silent now. I had their full attention. I've also been working on strengthening our client relationships. In fact, I have commitments from 3 major clients for extended contracts that will bring in an additional $2.8 million in revenue over the next 2 years. I could see several board members exchanging glances. Numbers like that had a way of cutting through confusion. So while I'm not sure why we're here celebrating my retirement, I'm happy to turn this into a celebration of Pinnacle Dynamics' bright future and my continued commitment to making that future a reality. The applause that followed was uncertain at first, then grew stronger as people processed what I'd said. I could see clients nodding approvingly, colleagues looking relieved, and board members looking very interested in those revenue projections. Richard stepped forward, his corporate smile firmly in place but his eyes betraying his anger. Amelia, I think there's been some confusion. Perhaps we should discuss this privately. I think transparency is important, I replied smoothly, especially when it comes to personnel decisions that affect the entire company. I turned back to the crowd. I want to thank everyone for their support over the years, and I want to assure you that I'm not going anywhere. This company has been my passion project, and I'm excited about what we can accomplish together in the years ahead. The party continued, but the energy had completely shifted. Instead of a farewell celebration, it had become something closer to a campaign rally. People approached me to discuss the projects I'd mentioned, clients expressed relief that I wasn't leaving, and board members asked pointed questions about my expansion plans. Richard disappeared about halfway through, claiming he had urgent calls to make. Monday morning brought a request for a meeting with the entire board of directors. I spent the weekend preparing, putting together detailed presentations on all the initiatives I'd mentioned at the party, plus a few additional ones I'd been developing. The boardroom was intimidating, with its long mahogany table and portraits of company founders glaring down from the walls. The 7 board members sat in their usual seats, with Richard at the head of the table, looking like he hadn't slept much over the weekend. Amelia, began Margaret Thompson, the board chair. We wanted to discuss the situation from Friday. There seems to have been some miscommunication about your employment status. I'm happy to clarify anything, I replied, setting my presentation materials on the table. I was as confused as everyone else about the retirement party. Richard cleared his throat. I may have misunderstood some casual conversations we'd had about your future plans. I don't recall any conversations about retirement, I said evenly. But I'm glad we have the opportunity to discuss my actual plans for the future. I launched into my presentation, outlining each project in detail: the expansion strategy, the client retention programs, the new market penetration initiatives. I had timelines, budgets, projected returns, and risk assessments. It was comprehensive, professional, and impressive. More importantly, it was profitable. These are ambitious plans, said board member James Harrison. What kind of support would you need to implement them? Primarily, I'd need a clear mandate from leadership and the resources to hire 2 additional team members. The projected ROI is substantial, and the timeline is aggressive but achievable. Margaret looked around the table. Richard, what's your assessment of these proposals? Richard was trapped. He couldn't dismiss obviously profitable initiatives without looking incompetent, but supporting them would mean keeping me in place, which defeated his entire purpose. They're comprehensive, he said finally. I'd need time to review the details. Of course, I said. I've prepared full reports for everyone, but I should mention that timing is crucial for several of these initiatives. We have a narrow window to capitalize on current market conditions. The board spent the next hour grilling me on specifics. I was ready for every question, every challenge, every request for additional data. This was my expertise, my domain, and I commanded it completely. By the end of the meeting, I had preliminary approval for 3 of my 5 initiatives and a promise to vote on the others within the week. Richard's face was stone throughout the proceedings. After the board meeting, I didn't go back to my office immediately. Instead, I walked to the coffee shop across the street and called my lawyer. The conversation was brief but productive. "You have a clear case for constructive dismissal," she told me. "The retirement party, the false narrative about your departure, the attempts to damage your professional reputation. It's textbook retaliation." "I don't want to sue," I said. "I want to stay and do my job, but I need protection. Let me make some calls. There are ways to formalize your position that will make it very difficult for them to retaliate further." That afternoon, I received a call from Margaret Thompson. "Amelia, I wanted to let you know that the board has voted to approve all 5 of your initiatives. We're also creating a new position, Vice President of Strategic Development, and we'd like to offer it to you." A promotion, complete with a salary increase, expanded authority, and a seat at the executive table. It was more than I'd hoped for. "I'm honored," I said. "I accept." "Excellent. We'll make the announcement tomorrow. And Amelia, the board was very impressed with your presentation. We're looking forward to working with you in this new capacity." The announcement went out Tuesday morning. The response from my colleagues was overwhelmingly positive. Clients sent congratulations, industry contacts reached out to schedule meetings, and my team seemed genuinely excited about the projects we'd be working on. Richard's response was more subtle. He sent a brief email congratulating me on the promotion and expressing his confidence in my abilities. But I could read between the lines. This was far from over. He was right, of course. Over the following weeks, I encountered a series of small obstacles: budget approvals that were delayed, vendor relationships that suddenly became complicated, administrative support that was mysteriously unavailable when I needed it. But I'd learned something important from our initial confrontation. Richard's power came from operating in shadows, from managing narratives and controlling information. In direct sunlight, with full transparency, he was much less effective. So I began documenting everything, every delay, every obstacle, every instance of non-cooperation. I shared regular updates with the board, framing them as progress reports on my initiatives, but actually creating a paper trail of interference. I also began building stronger relationships with key stakeholders, not just within the company, but with clients, vendors, and industry contacts. I made myself indispensable not just to Pinnacle Dynamics, but to the broader ecosystem we operated within. The breakthrough came 6 weeks after my promotion. I was working late, reviewing contracts for one of my new initiatives, when I noticed something interesting in the vendor agreements. The same accounting irregularities I'd identified in Richard's previous work were showing up in new contracts. This time, though, I was ready. I'd been building relationships with people throughout the company, including some in accounting and procurement who were frustrated with the way things were being handled. With their help, I was able to trace the pattern of irregularities back to its source. Richard hadn't just been padding consultant fees and creating suspicious vendor relationships. He'd been systematically overcharging clients and skimming the excess through a network of shell companies. It was sophisticated, carefully hidden, and completely illegal. I spent the next week building an airtight case. Financial records, email trails, contract analyses, and witness statements. When I was done, I had enough evidence to not only get Richard fired, but potentially prosecuted. The question was what to do with it. I could have gone straight to the board. But that felt too simple. Richard had tried to destroy my career with a public humiliation disguised as a celebration. I wanted his downfall to have the same theatrical quality. I decided to wait for the right moment. That moment came at the quarterly board meeting, where Richard was scheduled to present the company's financial performance. I'd been invited to give an update on my strategic initiatives, which were performing exceptionally well. I went first, delivering a presentation that highlighted not just the success of my projects, but the cost savings and efficiency improvements they'd generated. The board was clearly pleased with the results. Then Richard took the floor. He began his presentation with the usual corporate doublespeak about challenging market conditions and the need for strategic cost management. But as he clicked through his slides, I noticed something interesting. He was using inflated numbers, not the fake vendor invoices I'd discovered, but exaggerated projections that made the company's financial position look stronger than it actually was. It was a classic technique for hiding problems. but it also created an opportunity. When Richard finished his presentation, Margaret opened the floor for questions. Several board members asked about specific numbers, which Richard handled with his usual smooth confidence. Then I raised my hand. Richard, I have a question about the vendor expenses in Q3. I've been working closely with procurement on my initiatives, and I've noticed some discrepancies between the numbers in your presentation and the actual invoices I've seen. The room went quiet. Richard's smile flickered for just a moment before returning to full strength. I'm not sure what discrepancies you're referring to, he said. Perhaps we could discuss the details after the meeting. Actually, I think it would be helpful to clarify this now, I said, pulling out my carefully prepared folder. I've been doing some analysis of our vendor relationships as part of my cost optimization work, and I've found some interesting patterns. I began walking through the evidence, piece by piece, the inflated consultant fees, the suspicious vendor relationships, the pattern of overcharging that had been going on for months. I presented it all calmly, professionally, as if it were simply data analysis rather than career-ending accusations. Richard tried to interrupt several times, but I'd structured my presentation to build momentum. Each piece of evidence supported the next, creating an overwhelming case that was impossible to dismiss. By the time I finished, the room was dead silent. The board members were staring at Richard with expressions ranging from confusion to barely contained fury. Richard, Margaret said finally, do you have an explanation for these discrepancies? Richard's corporate composure finally cracked. This is clearly a personal attack, he said, his voice rising. Amelia has been looking for ways to undermine my authority ever since her promotion. This is exactly the kind of behavior that made me think she wasn't a good fit for the company. It was exactly the wrong thing to say. Are you suggesting that Ms. Brooks fabricated financial records? Asked board member Harrison. I'm suggesting that she's misinterpreting data to serve her own agenda. Richard replied. I stood up slowly, my red heels clicking on the polished floor. I have copies of all the original invoices, I said. I've also prepared a detailed analysis showing the pattern of overcharging and the flow of funds through various vendor accounts. If you'd like, I can walk you through each transaction individually. The vote to suspend Richard pending investigation was unanimous. He was escorted from the building that afternoon, his corporate smile finally replaced by the expression of someone who'd been thoroughly outmaneuvered. The investigation that followed confirmed everything I'd presented and more. Richard had been systematically defrauding the company for over 2 years, skimming hundreds of thousands of dollars through fake vendor invoices and inflated consultant fees. He was fired, criminally prosecuted, and eventually sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. I was offered his position as CEO, but I declined. I preferred my role as VP of Strategic Development, where I could focus on building rather than managing. But I did accept a seat on the board of directors, where I could help ensure that something like this never happened again. The company thrived under new leadership. My strategic initiatives exceeded all projections. The culture became more collaborative and transparent, and we earned recognition as one of the best places to work in the tech industry. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came a year later, when I received an invitation to speak at an industry conference about crisis management and corporate governance. The topic was Turning Threats into Opportunities: How One Executive's Attempted Sabotage Led to Company-Wide Reform. I accepted the invitation. Of course, after all, I had quite a story to tell. The speech went well, but the real highlight was the reception afterward. As I was networking with other executives, I spotted a familiar face across the room. It was Marcus Chen, the colleague who told me about Richard's rumor spreading at the industry mixer. Amelia, he said, approaching with a broad smile. I have to say, your presentation was brilliant, and I owe you an apology. For what? I asked. For believing that retirement story. I should have known better. You're clearly not the type to go quietly. I smiled, thinking about that Tuesday morning when I'd received the retirement party invitation. No, I said. I'm definitely not the type to go quietly. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. From a confused employee staring at a retirement party invitation to a board member and keynote speaker. It had been a long road, but worth every step. The best revenge, I'd learned, wasn't just surviving an attack on your career. It was thriving in spite of it, building something better than what came before, and making sure that your victory became a cautionary tale for anyone who might consider underestimating you in the future. My phone buzzed with a text from my assistant. Your 3 p.m. meeting tomorrow has been moved to 4 p.m. Also, there's a retirement party invitation in your inbox for Tom Morrison in accounting. Actual retirement this time. I checked. I laughed out loud. Some things never changed. But then again, some things changed completely. And sometimes, if you're lucky and prepared and willing to fight for what you've built, you get to be the one who decides which is which.